continue to have these important conversations. And one thing that we are really encouraging here at Proof of Talk is a debate. It's not to be agreeable. It's not to acknowledge everyone as having the proper. It's a thorough debate among brilliant minds, a healthy debate that allows us to kind of come to a conclusion where we might be in different spectrums of the same result, right? And so we were just having a talk backstage now that we are in such a pivotal crossroad right now that it's, as Charles Hoskinson put it in the spaces that we did in Twitter the other day, he said, it's kind of like the 1930s staring at the 1940s. We have this imminent thing bubbling up, and we know something huge is about to erupt, and there's going to come this massive change. We don't know what or how it will pan out, but we know that nothing will ever be the same again. And it is quite literally in our hands as we speak to figure out how we're going to get it right this time, right? And so it's my pleasure and honor to be speaking on the next panel. Something that is also very dear to my heart is how do we have integrity as leaders when everywhere you look around you, you see there's lots of money. I mean, the people who are leading and educating in this space, a lot of them, unfortunately, are highly motivated by the money. And we need to figure out how to lead with integrity, how to do this, as Yat Su put it, putting your heart, sweat, blood, and tears into something. We need to figure out how to do this with integrity and in a way that makes it stick and last and build for the long run and not worry about what happens. Because it's going to be turbulent, right? We all can acknowledge that this is going to be a very turbulent time, but not to put too much stress and emphasis on what happens in these next coming months, but rather, how are we going to shape this next decade? It's a decade. And so in the next panel, we're going to be discussing just that. The trust paradox in crypto, leadership's role in a trustless environment. So how have these industry leaders been able to foster that trust throughout these turbulent times, throughout FTX going down? All the people on the outside of Web3 have this terrible image of what crypto is. It's for scammers. It's for people who are on the fringes of society. But how do we bring that conversation back, rekindle that passion, and how have the people who have still stood today and their foundations are stronger than ever, how have they been able to do that? So we're going to have this conversation now with some of these industry leaders. I'd like to welcome to the stage the keynote speakers for today on the panel: John Woods, CTO of Algorand Foundation; Lily Liu, President of the Management of the Solana Foundation; Björn Wagner, co-founder and CEO of Parity Technologies; and Robby Yung, CEO of Animoca Brands. I will be moderating this today, which I'm so excited about. So please, a big round of applause. Welcome them to the stage, and we will get started. All right, so getting right into it. It feels surreal to be sitting with you all here in the same stage in the same place here in Paris, where all of the innovation is happening right now. And so we've seen you all speaking around the world, and it's not often that we get to have these industry leaders, these powerhouses of their individual companies here with us today on the same panel to have this discussion. So it's truly an honor to have you guys today. Thank you so much for being here. I'd like to go around and have each speaker introduce themselves and kind of what your role is in the company, and then we'll discuss how you envision what leadership should be. So,
shall I go first?
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. Great to be here. I'm John Woods. I'm the CTO, or the Chief Technology Officer, at the Algorand Foundation. Algorand is a layer 1 blockchain. It's programmable, and it's kind of similar to Ethereum, but we like to think better in many ways. And so my role there at the foundation really is to focus on the expansion of the ecosystem, the technical development of things like the developer tools, and caretaking of the protocol. Prior to that, I worked in terms of the crypto industry. I was the director of architecture on Cardano, where I led software architecture and applied cryptography for Cardano globally. And then previous to that, I worked as the lead architect and applied cryptographer with Consensus, which is an Ethereum-focused studio.
Amazing, thank you.
Hi, my name is Lily Liu. I'm the president of the Solana Foundation. Solana, some of you may have heard of it. It's also a layer 1, programmable layer 1 blockchain. Solana introduced a pretty unique architecture back in 2017, 2018, such that it's really fast and really cheap. I would say it's very performant. There's more than that as well, but it's basically 0.001 cents and about 400 milliseconds to process a transaction. The way we see the role of the foundation in the ecosystem is to help sort of facilitate the growth of the ecosystem, the adoption of open source technology, and then over time sort of give everything really back to the community.
Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. Hey, my name is Björn Wagner, and I'm a co-founder and the current CEO of a company called Parity Technologies. So Parity Technologies goes back roughly 7 years ago, when it was established by a group of individuals, including Gavin Wood and some of the core developers behind the Ethereum technology, the Ethereum Yellow Papers. And we have, over the past 7 years, I think we've really established ourselves as a powerhouse, engineering and research and development powerhouse in the blockchain space. Today, I think we are most well known for being a leading contributor to the Polkadot network, which is a layer 0, layer 1 blockchain technology, heterogeneous charting multi-chain blockchain technology. And yeah, happy to be here and exploring what leadership in blockchain is like. Thanks.
Amazing.
Hi, I'm Robby Yung. I'm the CEO of Animoca Brands, and we make games and invest in Web3.
Yeah, simply put, a powerhouse in the gaming industry for sure. It's a pleasure to be with you guys all here today, and I'm going to jump right into it. The topic of today, which is how do we foster that trust in your leadership roles within your company? And John, I think it was you and I that discussed that, the problem is semantics and how we talk about the word trust in the industry. So we're so used to having to rely on trust in order to operate. We've never had any other real true means to establish the comfort or engage in that trust with these counterparties. So what has been one of the pillars or the main sources of the Algorand Foundation for you guys to be able to establish that trust?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's a difficult one to answer. There's many different angles on it, right? There's the literal angle where you're thinking to yourself, well, we're stewards of a protocol that's protecting billions of dollars of value of people's money. And so everything from the responsibility of the lines of code we write in our open source code base, all the way to how we responsibly disclose security issues. And so we have a bug program where people can come along and disclose to us vulnerabilities or critical vulnerabilities within the protocol, and then get paid for that responsible disclosure so that we have an opportunity to fix it. Thankfully, that program hasn't yielded anything too scary, but again, I'm glad that we have it. I think that's one angle, right? You have to make sure that you are good stewards of people's money. And you got to remind yourself that when you're writing that line of code in the protocol, it may lock, hurt, or end up disrupting someone's personal wealth. I think the second piece that I think is interesting is, as an evangelist, if I can call myself that within the blockchain space, and certainly for Algorand, you got to be very careful what you say. And I think you got to be able to act in an integrous way and have authenticity when you're interacting with people, whether that's a Twitter space or even a chat like we're having today. I think it's really important to strike the right balance between creating excitement, but also not betraying your reputation because you only get it once. So it's a very fine line to walk because the community expect hype people all the time. They expect you to be hyping, exciting everyone. And I think some people take it too far. And what I've tried to do in my career is walk the line where I'm deeply vertically integrated and I understand the technologies I'm speaking about, but also hype responsibly, if that makes sense.
I like that, hype responsibly. Yeah, I mean, a lot of this whole industry is very hype driven, right? It's all about what are the cycles or the hot thing at the moment, but how do you survive and how do you maintain that spotlight as a protocol that's building for the future and that is focused on building something sticky and that lasts, like we've referenced, John, in the past. And Bjorn, you were telling me that exactly the same thing, that there's an overemphasis on short-term liquidity boosts and more people getting into protocols that are in the spotlight. But DOT, the Polkadot ecosystem was highly driven by community and was established with the community as the first thought instead of an afterthought, like has happened in this past year that we've seen. Can you speak a little bit on that?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to this core part of the semantics of the word trust that you brought up, right? Like I think in general, what we as a overall space are facing challenges in being correctly understood is that when, for example, the tagline of the Web3 Foundation from the early days, right? Like that was 2016, 17, was like, less trust, more truth, right? And so generally, I think the challenge for all of us is that trust is not necessarily experienced as something negative, right? Like we as humans want to be able to trust another, right? And we often make this trust, like the ability to trust one another based upon observation of very positive characteristics, right? That are in human nature. Compassion, observing that one another have compassion, that they exhibit integrity and so forth, right? Whereas like a bit of a longer form of the tagline, maybe better understood, right? What we actually want to do is we want to create a world that's based upon truthful interactions rather than trustful. And what that means is, again, we want to bring agency to people, and we want to bring that agency to people by the means that they do not have to rely on trust to have the assurance that the outcome of an interaction actually will be what they expect it will be, but rather there are verifiable characteristics, properties of a system that give us this assurance, this confidence, so that I do not have to rely on the trust in an individual or an authority. Now, but crucially, and this is where it goes back to leadership, I believe, right? The way we think about leadership is not in the traditional sense of, oh, leadership is control, right? Control over these systems, control over the decisions. No, the role of leadership we see in that realm, which is quite to the contrary. We see leadership in building a cohesive, supporting the building of a cohesive community rallied around shared values, intentions, a certain ethos, right? And that ethos needs to include that we actually want to get away from having power accumulated in any single entity or institution or person, right? But in order to do that, right, we need to empower our communities, our members, to make decisions for themselves, to come to conclusions for themselves. And so I think the role of leadership for us is much more in the sense of reinforcing certain ideas and values, right, on one hand, and on the other hand, equipping, empowering our community members to analyze these systems, and we do that mostly through education, right? I think that's very crucial, and to your point, right, when do you do that? I think you have to do it from day one. You really have to do it from day one because it is in human nature that people look for leaders that tell them what to think, what to do, what to rally behind. But if we do that, we will all as a community fall into that trap, go the easy route, and I think to that extent, this personal cult and hype around certain things is somewhat the enemy of intellectual rigor and will prevent us to eventually get to the goal we want to get to. And so we see that super crucial. Transparency, accountability, education. That's the role of leadership much more than being imperative around what actions need to happen, what the technical execution is, right?
Right. No, I completely agree with you on that. And it sounds like leadership in its sense that you discuss is more guidance for the community, kind of like guidelines for how the community can interact, but in the end, the community is the one that is leading, and it's built with that vision in mind from day one, which is one of the ways you've been able to establish trust, right, as a protocol. And the people who founded or were part of the founding team, they were very people within the Web3 ecosystem that had that vision to begin with. And so, segueing on to Robby and Lily, I'd like to talk about how you guys are able to establish trust and also specific instances within your own company. So we'll start with you, Robby, sure. About Animoca, how they've been able to establish that trust throughout the years amidst the brutal bear market that we've seen and all of the collapses, and how have you guys been able to kind of establish that trust as a company?
So I think a lot of it has to do, and of course it's ironic because we all deal in trustless technology, right? But I think it has to do with just very traditional sort of business practices, meaning you need to do what you say you're going to do. And to the points both gentlemen mentioned earlier, I think it's about transparency when things change, because obviously we're in a technology environment where stuff breaks and things don't always go as planned. And so when problems happen, you need to be transparent to your customers or community, depending on how you want to think of it, so that they understand that, yes, something went wrong, you know it's gone wrong, you're trying to fix it, and please be patient. And I think that's how you continue to foster goodwill with your community and your customer base, by being transparent. And one example from our past is we were doing a mint for NFTs in one of our games, and the Discord got hacked associated with the project. And it wasn't something that was our fault, it wasn't our platform, it was Discord, but it was our game, and it was our brand, and it was a community perceiving this as a problem with our product, even though technically it wasn't. And so rather than say, it's not our problem, it's Discord's problem, we took ownership of it because it's our brand at stake. And we said to the community, look, people who lost money because there was a fake mint, we will compensate you because we want to take care of you because you're our customers. And that's hopefully going to generate enough goodwill that they decide to stay in the project, but also continue and join us on other projects in future.
Right, so it's how you handle when things break that's so important.
So I think that's an interesting one. So like, I've had a similar situation with Algorand. One of our major wallets, which is, again, not a product that we control. We don't write the code, we don't run the backend. I don't have oversight, it's closed source backend. It had a hack recently, and again, like, it wasn't gargantuan scale, but it was still like, $10 million worth of people's money distributed over many, many thousands of users. It's still a lot of money for some of these people. And so we had this thing where we were trying to decide, what's the right level of involvement for the foundation, right? Because yes, we do want to make sure people trust it, and if the average person or a regular person doesn't feel like they can trust the software, the coin, the technology, then they're gonna shy away from it. But again, it's tricky for us because we have, of course, the funds to reimburse people, but then you're setting a precedent about reimbursing people for a third-party product, maybe. And in this case, it was a chunk of money, and it's like, well, what about the next week when someone else comes along and they say, well, I'm sorry, but I've lost my keys, or my funds were stolen too. Do I get my money back? And you see, I think it's a tricky line to walk. I'm not saying I have the perfect answer, but it's something we as well faced. I admire the way you handled it. In our situation, we decided not to reimburse the public for who had lost because we didn't want to set that precedent. But what we did do, which is, I guess, to the people who have lost money, maybe little compensation, but we hired a professional auditing company to come in and find out what happened. And we, of course, helped engage with law enforcement and chain analysis companies. But yeah, we didn't refund them in the end.
So a mental model that we oftentimes use is what actually is a layer 1 blockchain. We don't consider it to be a company. We liken it more to a city. And it's a pretty critical kind of difference in how you think about it, and therefore what your role is and what you're building. So, many people who work in crypto, they come from the corporate world, and the typical corporate model is one where we're very familiar with. You hire workers, right? You raise some money, you hire some workers, you develop a product, you sell it for a profit to users, and you take that generated profit and you give it back to your shareholders in some form over time. And your incentive is a very clear one, which is to centralize as much resource, labor, and capital onto your balance sheet, right? You want to keep it within your sort of, within your domain. Whereas if you're building a city, right, and this, these days most of the cities they seem to be sort of already built in status quo, but in fact, in just our lifetimes, there's been places like Shenzhen that have been built from swamps to cities, metropolises of 20 million people. And the role of, let's call it the mayor's office in the building of a city is fundamentally different from that of a leadership team, a management team in a company, right? So rather than hiring workers, what you want to do is you want to attract producers to come and produce and build in your city and create products in an economy for other citizens within that city to use and to prosper from. And instead of creating a product, really, what you want to do is you want to create a culture that attracts people, right? So it's really more about attracting rather than creating and centralizing. And so to me, that is a pretty fundamental difference in terms of how you think about what your even objective is, right? As a layer one blockchain, as some entity within that ecosystem as well. And so to me, I think the closest analogy of what, for example, a fill-in-the-blank foundation or labs or DevCo entity, what their role is really to be some form of that kind of mayor's office, right? And if you think about it, if you think about some of the most immortal cities on the planet, we're in one. Another one is, for example, in New York. People don't go move to New York because of who the mayor is, right? In fact, you'll find a lot of people living in any of these cities that identifies, for example, being a New Yorker, and they might really, really dislike the mayor's office. And that's okay because it's not about that so-called leadership team, right? Yes, they have an impact, but actually, in my opinion, the most successful cities and communities, which at scale are cities and at larger scale are civilizations, right? Are those that actually really draw their vibrancy from the city, from the culture, and actually have some of the smallest governments out there. And so that to me has been sort of really at the philosophical lifeblood of why crypto to begin with. And I think we oftentimes use the term community to describe what we're building these days, because that's, we're all very familiar with the whole idea that people, spend a lot of time online, create meaningful relationships online, and do meaningful things online. But really, to me, that's really just the trailhead of where we are 20 years into the internet, where I think like crypto really adds on to that is the ability to transition communities into economies. And start to approach more the sort of concept of a city-state, and then at scale, well, over time, it can certainly scale from there. So,
I completely agree with that. I think it's a very good way to put it. I see Algorand the same way. I see cryptocurrencies generally the same way. You got to build a beautiful place that has swimming pools and kids' schools and like whatever, all of these amenities that people are used to, and then they're going to want to come. And those things within our world is software like wallets, developer tools, etc. But I think just if you take that analysis, or the analogy rather, of the metropolis or the city, which is what really these decentralized operating systems that we're building are, you got to have the right level of, I guess, interaction with your citizens. And so if someone's home gets broken into or someone's car gets stolen, you don't go and give them a new house necessarily. You want to have things like insurance products available within your city, but you're not going to go down and the government just doesn't hand it all back to you. And I think if we lose that, then we lose one of the virtues of this whole industry, which is the self-sovereignty and the decentralization. If you have a central authority that makes everything right, all you're back to is a slow version of the central bank.
Yeah, the old tired system with new amazing tech. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. No, I think that's really interesting, the analogy of cities, and that it doesn't necessarily have to do with the leader of that city, but rather what's been built around it. And the people who are there are inspired by that protocol. They're inspired by that community. They want to build there because of that. So it sounds like, although there are many different perspectives here, community is the pillar of all of this, right? Whether that was the first thought or an afterthought or however it's come together, I feel that's a very interesting way of shaping this narrative of, okay, how do we foster this leadership within our community? And to that degree, like, how would we discuss then fostering that trust within different protocols with different levels of decentralization, right? How do we balance that out and communicate that to the world in a proper way that they trust whether, okay, this protocol is completely decentralized and I get to build here versus one that might have more hand in what's going on?
To me, I think it comes down to culture at the end of the day. I know that that it's somewhat paradoxical that in this industry where so much is about sort of very tangible technological advances, actually some of the most important things at the same time are highly intangible, right? But in the same way that in the offline world, different cultures are good at different things, and I think you see that rapid experimentation evolution in crypto as well, where there are some cultures that are very near-term mercenary, and there are others that have a greater long-term orientation, and those are actually things that really sort of attract and bind people over time, right? One of the most significant things in my mind about the sort of dynamics about how crypto communities and cultures are created is, unlike when you move to a city, you've got a high fixed cost, right? You've got rent, you physically live there, your job might be there, your family might be there. It's really hard to leave. In crypto, it's actually very easy to depart and leave. You don't have a fixed cost base there, right? You can literally sell your tokens, maybe take some pain, depending, and then you can get out, right? So what that means is the dynamics of sort of citizen capture is very different in a crypto community versus an offline community, and that means the value proposition has to actually sort of stem from an attractive culture that brings people there. So to me, it's actually about, it has to do with self-regulation of values. Be kind, I think, is one. When it comes to leadership, there's an abundance of leadership. It should not sort of centralize to a figurehead or some set of figureheads. There should be a disincentive for people who may be in certain positions in various organizations. There should be a disincentive for them to centralize power and attention to themselves. And so, in my mind, it's just a very different set of incentives that actually does mirror, some of the cities we see around the world that already in real life have more decentralized incentives, which is more about empowering citizens rather than empowering, government capture.
I think that this is really interesting. I think there's one area where I somewhat disagree, right? I think technology is very well, extremely importantly at the center of it, and I explain why. So, the technology we're building, enabled in the first place a different paradigm and model, the trustlessness, right? The ability to interact with one another and have the outcome of that interaction that we want without having put faith in the other person's intention in the first place. That's why we're here. That's why we do that, right? Now, and the ability for us, right, to look at these systems, analyze these systems for many, right? That's why open source is so important, right? Give us the confidence that these systems work as they're meant to work. And I think it's key, absolutely key, that we as people don't have to resort to, this leader, I trust him, right? They care about this mission and it's going to be, decentralized and so forth. It's not right now, right? And don't look at the technology too deep. That doesn't matter that much, right? That's why I strongly disagree, right? And particularly in combination with what we've seen with FTX, right? So a lot of people, right, rightfully said FTX was a harbinger for crypto, right? It proves that crypto's fucked. The community got it all wrong, right? For me and many of the folks that have been following that mission for many, many years, right? They see it rather as a clear demonstration for the need of the systems we put forward, right? FTX, at the end of the day, none of this is surprising in the sense of they are following the old model. They are clearly centralized institutions that have clear economic incentives around that, have no need to be transparent, have no means to enable us to verify their claims, right? What shocks me though, right, and that's going back to the former point of how much does technology matter and the verifiability of the properties of these systems is we've seen how some leaders in these protocol spaces, right, have gotten in bed with these very much institutions, right, and thereby have put their users and stakeholders at the peril of these centralized institutions. And I think that goes again to the point of the trust in these leaders, right? At the end of the day, don't trust, verify. Look at the track record, right? Everyone should look at the track record. Is what they purport, are their actions following their intentions that they put forward, right? And I think that caused for me much more damage to the crypto space, right? Than the somewhat expectable outcome that some of these centralized institutions fuck up, right? It's much more shocking and much more boom for crypto that those very people that try to build a different model have gotten in bed with these very institutions. And that I think is a bigger issue for us.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, so it's not a crypto problem, it's a human problem. It's the human nature that gets involved within that governing system and the leadership that, creates room for the things to go awry, right? So just to reference the space again with Charles Hoskinson, he said we're going from those who are governed to the ones who are governing, and the shift between don't be evil to can't be evil. And not to say evil in that context, but you know, like don't be corrupt to can't be corrupt, right? So he is one of the people who's crying on that side of the decentralization, like we need to tend more toward this. But then as we do approach the new society, maybe there needs to be some kind of hybrid bridge between the two. And I fully believe that decentralization needs to be the foundation of this movement. But how do we do that in a proper way? Because one of the other things he said is, if we go the other route and we start centralizing things more, we're under the pretense that people are never going to be able to govern themselves, that they can't learn to do that, and we're not going to push them to learn to do that. So what would you say to that, Robby?
Sure. So I come from a slightly different perspective because obviously we're application layer. So we're always thinking about customer relationships and how to build new communities inside these new jurisdictions, if you will. And I think the important thing that we think about is we love the idea of decentralization, but decentralization for us is the goal. It's not the starting point. Because the challenge that we have is in order to build community, you literally have to build it. It takes time. And so if you think about really successful game communities, I always put, I always put something like EVE Online on a pedestal because they have an incredibly sticky community that's been playing for literally 20 years. And it's been built over goodwill and interpersonal bonds of trust for a very long time, to the point where they have community leaders, they have people, they differentiation of roles. I mean, it's as close to a metaverse as I can imagine, frankly. And that takes time. And we can now use blockchain tools to save a lot of that time, you know, to be able to give them these trustless devices. But we still need to figure out who are going to be those leaders, who are going to want to take on those roles in and of themselves, because it's also not purely about financial incentive. And many Web3 applications make the mistake of thinking financial incentives are the only motivator of human emotion. And that's also a challenge too. So I think for us, we view games as something that we want to have decentralized over time, but we have to first attract people in, do narrative storytelling, give them a reason to want to be there, and then they will then want to devote their own time to participating and donating their time to the community.
That's interesting, is what I was speaking to, like maybe a bridge between the two, because of course we understand the importance of decentralization and not relying on a leader to govern the masses, right? But at the same time, we're transitioning into this technology that for many is very daunting. And so what you're saying, Robby, is introducing them in a way that maybe is working toward that, but we're not there yet, and we're building that community and fostering that innovation as we go. And so there has to be some kind of meeting in between, right? A bridge, a hybrid bridge.
There needs to be a transition, because what you don't want is to launch your game or your worlds, and then all the players are just looking around saying, okay, so who's in charge? And nobody knows who's in charge.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and I would just add to that and say, in my personal view, decentralization of these systems, and by the way, you're right, Bjorn, I agree with you strongly that the system's characteristics should be strong enough that people can trust within the system, for those who are able to understand the architecture and maybe review the code. But I also, taking from your point, decentralization is really a spectrum. And I think any blockchain that's saying they're perfectly decentralized whilst being perfectly secure and perfectly scalable is lying. And so Algorand's not perfectly decentralized, but it's an end goal. And so there are a number of technical ways as we're moving towards that, but it takes time. And you can only get there when you have a large number of users and the stake in a proof-of-stake system like Algorand or Cardano or Ethereum, where the stake is well distributed and evenly distributed, and there's not that many whales, and it takes this kind of like a decay of the system a little bit, or decay certainly of the token, in order to achieve that decentralization. So I think it should be an end goal, and I think any blockchain that's not focused on getting there in an honest way is doing a disservice to its users.
Absolutely, and in an honest way. Well, to be fair, like now in this market, the place in this market cycle, we're here with the people who are, trying to do things honestly, because the rest have been pretty much washed away, right? And so the people that are here now are establishing that trust. And I think what we touched on earlier, Robby, it was really interesting what you said about, not all people's incentives are financial. And people have that assumption from the outside that within this community, all incentives are financial, but that's just not the case. And Lily, to what you were speaking about, building cities and having people who are inspired by what you're building and where you're going, yeah, that's amazing. And that requires some level of leadership. So just for you to touch on a little bit of what we've been speaking about in the Solana community, how you guys have started and what you're working toward in that way.
Yeah, so I think that as a general purpose layer one, and kind of on the city, I guess on the city metaphor that we've been using, I think that you have to have breadth and depth across various verticals. If you're just focused on one vertical, so to me the part of the corporate fallacy oftentimes you hear in company, singular focus, singular focus, singular focus. I actually think that can be have some pitfalls if you're thinking about building kind of a layer one blockchain. If you're a general purpose blockchain and you only really have depth in one vertical, then you're actually an app chain without any of the benefits of being an application specific chain when it comes to, on the technical side, the ability to provide customized infrastructure and customizability, so on and so forth, right? So I actually think that as a general purpose blockchain, you have to have a diversity of use cases because that sort of builds, that is, to me, fundamentally part of the value proposition of being a general purpose blockchain. And so, that's something that I think is quite important in the same way that you can be a city like New York and you can have a robust Broadway theater industry and Wall Street. They couldn't be more different, yet they coexist, even though they have very, very different sort of cultures, but they're still New Yorkers at the end of the day. And so specifically, sort of what do I think is enabled by very high performance? I mean, I think a lot, right? I think at the end of the day, it's everything is better if you have broadband versus a 56K modem. I think that a lot of the kind of use cases and the ways that we've architected some of the most popular applications out there are fundamentally, from a product perspective, built around performance insufficiencies, right? And many of the sort of many layers of architecture trying to compensate for that. To me, a very simple example is if you take something like a company like a Netflix. And Netflix existed when we had dial-up modems. What were they doing? They were mailing DVDs back and forth. And then fast forward 20 years and you actually have a performant underlying layer of technology. And what are they doing? I guess similar company, but fundamentally different, streaming, right? And to me, that is kind of the difference between where we are today, where you can sort of see the glimmers on the horizon, and you can see the possibility and the potential use cases, but you actually really do need, to your point, like the infrastructure of course matters, right? I was just saying it's necessary but not sufficient earlier, but then once you really have that ability to actually support the imagined use cases, then that's necessary for everything else to flourish. So anyways, the simple answer, payments, financial use cases. To me, a big one that I think is a white space in crypto generally is payments-based DeFi, right? All of the DeFi we implicitly associated with buy-sell, trading-oriented, right? AMMs originally and all the stuff beyond that. And then I think that there's send-receive DeFi that doesn't really exist anywhere, right? Because up until now we didn't have a performant payments layer, but I think there's a tremendous amount of financial innovation that can happen on that area, and various others, but that's kind of one that I personally am really excited about.
Well, that's really interesting. And segueing to the last half of this conversation, what we're here to do is to have takeaways as leaders and to kind of like interchange ideas and consequences of what have happened and how you've solved those issues. So I'd like to speak to some of the issues that you've seen and how you were able to solve them to maintain that trust within your community, because some issues are very different. For example, you and I discussed, John, that sometimes when a protocol is building for the long term and they're really doing the long grind and with the vision and it's not the hot token of the moment, it can be difficult to keep up the morale while you're trying to do something with integrity and to just keep building slowly but surely. So what have been some issues you've faced and how have you been able to overcome those and communicate that correctly to the community?
Sure. I think in the green room they said there was no hard questions, and you're cheating. Yeah, it's a great question. I think the MyAlgo situation, the wallet that was hacked, was a good test of that. But maybe a bit more, something a bit more interesting, I think, is how you move towards the future state of the chain. And so some things that are really important to us at Algorand, because you got to remember these blockchains, or I like to think of them as decentralized operating systems, are effectively the intersection of applied mathematics, applied cryptography, distributed systems engineering. There's a whole bunch of different disciplines, and yeah, a lot of it is computer science under the umbrella of computer science. But you got to hire a whole bunch of people with all these different skill sets and integrate them all together in order to achieve. It's a really complex system that we all build on or with. And so, I think, as you just said, sometimes it can be more fun to be out there celebrating the latest cool NFT or a meme token or a really interesting DeFi app. But it's harder maybe from a foundation's point of view to hunker down and start building out things like maybe post-quantum resistance or make a deep architectural change to the consensus mechanism or to the data propagation layer in order to achieve further further decentralization. And so these are the things that I think will separate the wheat from the chaff in the future. And these are the kind of things that we're concentrating on now, which are expensive to build because the skill sets are rare. And they're also hard work, and they're not that sexy in the short term. But I hope that, I wouldn't call it problem solving, but that focus on future problem solving, specifically the post-quantum one. And I know that people think the quantum computer thing is like, a bit of a kind of, is it real, is it not? It's the kind of boogeyman that never appears. But, if you look at the advancements in the space, it won't be long until we have Shor's algorithm running on some, error-correcting qubits in an NSA basement, and then we'll be thankful that we put that time into, moving a post-quantum signature scheme onto Algorand. And so I think that focus on the future without the instant gratification of the sexy latest thing is how I approach, or how I think we should, a change should best approach things.
Absolutely. It's not easy, and it's a long, hard grind sometimes, but it is the most, the best path forward, in my opinion, as well, to build for the future and to establish those foundations, even when it's not in the spotlight and when it's not the hottest coin at the moment. I would like to hear your opinion on that as well, because DOT has had a similar, the Polkadot ecosystem has a similar development in that it's more slow and methodical and building things. Please tell us about that.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you for that. So, for those of you that are not familiar with Polkadot, right? Like Polkadot emerged, we started working on Polkadot really in 2016 on essentially on the back of the learnings that we took from building Ethereum, right? There was an early prototype, great, fantastic, has really done us all a great service in getting a lot of momentum around this movement, the idea we can build a different paradigm of how we interact and engage and so forth. But it has had significant shortcomings that we realized, right? And which is why we came to the conclusion that we want to build something slightly different, and we think it's important because we do not think certain characteristics, certain elements can be built into the system in hindsight. And that's where I'm going to talk a little bit around some of the things where I think it cannot be an afterthought. Give you 3 examples, right? And they might be slightly technical, but one is governance, right? How do we ensure these systems can evolve over time to a changing environment, can assimilate new technologies as we find them, better ways of achieving what we want to achieve, right? Well, there are 2 core aspects. One, the technology architecture has to be modular, sufficiently modular to be able to integrate this new technology. That's one. But the other one, you need very good mechanisms to ensure the stakeholders, the community, the crucial stakeholders behind this technology and platform can come to a clear decision how the system should evolve. And we've seen in Ethereum how the lack of clear, explicit processes and systems that are auditable, right? Where there's accountability around these decisions and the enactment of these decisions speak the upgrade from this system to the next system, the lack thereof led to stagnation in progress, right? I'll give you 3 examples. Think about scalability. We knew in 2014 these systems don't scale enough, right? We had ideas. These ideas have been around. With Polkadot, we implemented them from the get-go, right? When we launched, we had a scalable system, a multi-chain system that has shared security and some other properties, right? Now, going back to the governance point, it is incredibly hard to bake these characteristics into the system in hindsight. So in the Polkadot case, right, like we built the system in a way that the the blockchain is self-aware of its functioning. What that means is you do not need anything else, and somebody submitting new code to the blockchain and the community conducting a referendum or a vote for the system to change to the next. There is no entity that needs to press a button. No single small collection of entities that need to still approve, right? And I think that's a major benefit towards what we want to build. Now, trying to build that into the system in hindsight is incredibly hard, if not impossible. Similarly, you will see that with other characteristics like sharding, right? In Ethereum, we have seen it. We don't have sharding today still, right? This system doesn't scale inherently. We try to bake it in via certain roll-up mechanisms, right? That are all, in my opinion, falling short of what is needed, right? Whereas in the Polkadot case, where we started earlier than most, we launched later than most, but the reason for that is not that we aren't working fast enough, that we didn't have enough, our community isn't big enough. Quite the contrary. If you look at Electric Capital Developer Report, for example, right? Polkadot has the second largest developer community only after Ethereum in the world, right? And they have the most commits as well, right? So the reason there is like, we don't take this mission lightly. We don't, try to cut corners and so forth, right? Particularly not in these areas where you will have an incredibly hard time to change the system after the fact or bake something in. Another example is the light client enabled, right? That was one of the hottest topics in the early Ethereum days, because for these systems to be truly have these properties of liveness and censorship resistance that we really want the systems to have, right? You need an ability for anyone in the world to interact with these systems without, again, relying on somebody that facilitates that interaction. Well, in most blockchain platforms, you have these RPC providers, such as Infura. In Ethereum, I think 75 or 80% of all transactions are being routed through the central actor, right? A central actor that essentially has corporate interest, shareholder interest, right? And that will implement policies that they are forced to implement as a US company. Has actually happened already. Now, it's going to be really hard to get away from that, and the technology is not set up to facilitate the individual consumer to engage with that technology, to read data, submit data, right, in a way that is ergonomic, right? Today, you do not have light client infrastructure, whereas in Polkadot, we needed to take our time to make sure the system is able to offer that and have that from day one, because otherwise, it ain't happening. And then maybe it's not a problem today, but it will be a problem eventually for these systems.
Well, that's an interesting take on it. So you're saying that it's virtually impossible or very difficult to add that after the fact. Well, we have the other side of the spectrum that is, we're going to build as is and develop this as we go. So what would be your counters to that?
No, I agree. We're doing the same thing. I think you need to build a modular system, and what you described is, I think, just good systems architecture. It takes time. But no, I totally agree. And when we're building out new signature schemes or pluggable consensus or changing the way data propagates, we're doing so because we've built this modular architecture. And so I was kind of making the same point, but just focusing on specifics.
No, it's interesting because Lily, for example, your perspective from the Solana Foundation, Solana has had a lot of attention lately, and it has been that hot token. So you've had to navigate other difficulties within that, right? That maybe some of the other tokens haven't been, or systems haven't been dealing with. What have been some of your challenges, and what would you say to counter Björn here?
I don't know that I would counter it, but I will say, certainly when users are using your chain faster and with greater demand than you anticipated. So, for example, it's well known that back in 2021, there are some pretty hot NFT mints, and essentially people would unleash these bots to try to snipe these IDOs or NFT mints, and essentially was users effectively DDoSing the chain, right? And those are the types of things that you have a roadmap for development, but then if your roadmap, even throw people resources at it, can only progress at a certain rate, especially if it's already a live network, right? You're kind of like rebuilding the engine in the car as you're driving it. And if your usage goes up by 100x, that's essentially kind of what happened to Solana. And so Solana had to do quite a number of things that, we call it protocol upgrades, but I mean, these are like very substantial changes, right? Ripping out a transport protocol, implementing local fee markets. I mean, these are like pretty innovative types of, to say that they're features is, I suppose, factually true, but like they're pretty significant types of changes to be making. These things are kind of living pieces of technology as well. And there's no question that there's, oftentimes very heated debate around not just the architecture, but then, all of the other sort of elements attached to that, because, crypto is sort of, all of the conversation is default open, right? I don't actually think that in crypto we have more discord, we have more disagreement, more like flaming communities or anything like that. It's just that in the non-crypto world, that typically will happen in, let's call it a private company, which has 10 years of closed-door privacy and decision-making amongst sort of a select group of people can more or less sit around a table, whereas crypto from day one, right, you not only go liquid at seed stage, effectively you're publicly traded at seed stage rather than 10 years on, but then also it means that everything sort of has to be more or less out in the open, and it becomes like a very difficult dynamic at times, and a very sort of interesting dynamic because you sort of have to manage, if you do it well, you have an unlimited number of stakeholders, but there's also challenges that come with that. So
yeah, it comes with its own challenges, but you have all been doing a wonderful job at navigating those, and it's amazing to be able to have this conversation and share with other people who are going to be navigating similar issues, because you are at the forefront of this movement, all of you.
And one last thing I'd add, which is like it applies to all of us. When you're making changes, like you are right, absolutely. Like Lily's right, blockchains are software, and software is infinitely updatable, and you could just do a massive commit that changes everything. And so, they are very malleable and flexible, and the architectures can change. But what doesn't change is, of course, the blockchain. And so regularly we want to do features, right? And we can't do them because, I'd love to do this, but if I do that, we effectively deprecate, or break something that was existing in the past. And you got to make sure that whatever you change doesn't break any app going back to the Genesis block. And that's quite restrictive, because many times in other architecture, when you're building other software, Apple can decide, well, in iOS 17, I'm going to deprecate an API. I don't care if it doesn't work in iOS 9 anymore. I just don't care. And they do that all the time. Whereas we don't have that in the blockchain industry. We don't have that flexibility, right? We have to be very careful that a change doesn't break an app for just a single user, because then we're locking their funds, and it's not fair. And so this is a huge restriction in terms of your software engineering approach.
Yeah, I think it's easy to have an opinion from the outside, but until you know the inner workings of what's happening behind the protocol and how it affects it when you do make changes and when you do have to go through this whole process, that's when the real impact happens. So it's interesting to hear from you guys as leaders in that innovation. And Robby, from a different perspective, coming from your end, I mean, Animoca has been the word, around the industry. You're leaders in your sector, and people turn to you. And you have the responsibility to guide these people, Animoca Brands, in developing what is the gaming industry and everything that you guys have built up. So how have you seen this industry evolving, and what has been crucial for you, and what do you think we need to look to for the future?
I would say, first and foremost, I think it's really important for us as an industry to support each other, because it's the only way we're going to grow as an industry. Because I think that, in light of all of these comments, the technology is fantastic. But it's only fantastic if you actually spend the time to read the white paper and understand what it does. And the vast majority of users do not. And they don't care. And all they do is read something that happens on Twitter, and they're like, okay, maybe I'll buy that. And that's been a lot of the behavior. And so the question is, do you try to force feed them your white paper so that you can say, here, you're an informed and educated customer? Or do we, as leaders in the space, and that applies to, frankly, everybody at this event, do we support each other and say, okay, look, I just saw something on Twitter, and this guy, he's absolutely missing the point. I should correct the record, because people listen to what I have to say, and they're talking about my friend Björn, who I know is telling the truth and doing a good job, so I should stick up for him. And that's my role as his colleague in the industry. And I think that's actually really important, because hot takes on Twitter, like, you can spend all day long reading that stuff, and half of it is wrong, and it's about communication as opposed to technology, and communication is hard.
Wow, that was, you nailed it. That was spot on. And just the fact that you're saying that you have to use that reputation that you've built in order to foster other legitimate conversations. And one of the most amazing things I think about the industry are those conversations on Twitter. However, they are more prone to spreading misinformation. And so how do we shape this now? I guess what it comes down to is taking responsibility as people who are at the cutting edge of this technology and have this reputation and have built up this trust to foster that in the right places and guide the conversation and help develop what will happen in the future generations to come. So you guys, it's been an absolutely wonderful panel. Thank you so much for being here. Big round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. We're gonna have to cut this now. We don't have much time for questions and answers. Maybe we can take one question. Do we have any questions in the audience? Anybody? I know people are anxious to get going to lunch. If you do have questions, we are kind of short for time. You guys are going to be around here, right? We have networking rooms, VIP speaker room for the VIPs as well, attendees. And again, thank you guys so much for being here. It was an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah.